Do you read the ICML or NeurIPS proceedings regularly? Or maybe, do you want to start? Data Skeptic is looking for a few listeners who'd be interested in participating as panelists for a one-time episode where we review papers from a recent conference. Our first one is going to be the ICML conference coming up in July. Panelists will need to lead a quick discussion about one paper that they pick and be ready to chat about a few others that the group selects. Ideally, panelists have some public speaking skills, maybe conference talks or something on YouTube. If you're interested in participating in our panel, send an email to panelists@dataskeptic.com. Include a brief description of yourself, a resume if you think that's appropriate, and for sure share a few links so we can get to know a few things about you. And please get those applications in by Friday, May 13th. Welcome to another installment of Data Skeptic Physically Distributed. In this episode, we take a further look at remote learning and remote education. In addition to understanding some of the challenges educators face, we now have a good deal of data on what are effective practices for transitioning to remote learning. In this episode, I speak with Casey Wagner and Tahia Chowdhury. We get insights from both of them about independent classroom experiences during this time of transition.
Hi, I'm Casey Wagner. I am a lecturer at Princeton University, and I'm also a member of the Simons Observatory and Atacama Cosmology Telescope collaborations.
Before we get into our main area and the paper we're going to talk about, could you share a little bit more about your work there? Are there any particular areas of cosmology or things to highlight?
Broadly speaking, both of our collaborations build telescopes to measure the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is the oldest light in the universe. And our goals really are to measure the CMB, that's the acronym, in much more detail to learn even more about the beginning of the universe and how the universe evolved. And so I play a small role on these two large teams.
If you don't mind, I'm a little curious about that. I know that the radiation is sort of fading with time, maybe not in a super measurable way, but we know it's degrading. Are we able to really measure the full information content that's there, or what's the cutting edge of the precision of how we can measure it?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's degrading. What I would say is that the CMB itself, it's been traveling for a long time as the universe is expanding. And so it's changing a little bit. The wavelength of the light is expanding. We call that redshifting. And so this changes some of its fundamental properties. I would say that it's actually quite the converse. As time goes on, our ability to do detailed experiments and with improved equipment, that improves quite a bit. And so as time goes on, we're able to harvest even more information from the CMB. So that's kind of the state where we are. The CMB has kind of been a field that's been around it was first discovered in the 60s. So, it's only a 50 or 60-year-old field. And each sort of decade, we make significant steps forward in the amount of detail that we can measure the CMB, and out of that, we get more and more science. And so I would actually say that we're a field that's progressing in how much we can get out of the measurements.
Are you going to bump into the Planck length or the Planck time at some point?
We won't directly bump into the Planck time. The reason being that the CMB was actually emitted about 380,000 years after what people call the Big Bang. And the CMB itself doesn't directly measure things from the very beginning of the universe or, from the most distant parts of the universe. It's in those much, much older times before the CMB really was emitted, that you would run into the Planck length or the Planck scale. But by making these more and more detailed measurements of the CMB that I've mentioned, you can try to sort of infer some things about the very, very earliest times in the universe, even before the CMB was emitted. And sort of the flagship measurement along these lines are by measuring the CMB in detail, more specifically measuring the polarization of the CMB light. We are looking for this evidence of an inflationary period in the early universe. And so as we make these more and more detailed measurements, we can learn about whether or not there was an inflationary period. And this inflationary period would have happened at a time much earlier in the universe when the Planck scales was more important.
Well, Well, it's fascinating work. Every once in a while, I'll catch headlines with these topics, and I'm always eager to hear what's the latest and greatest.
Yeah. I'm happy to come back on another episode and discuss more of this in more detail if you're interested.
Yes, let me do my homework, and we'll put a bookmark in it for that.
All right, sounds good.
But what I am prepared to talk about a little bit today is remote work, and in your case in particular, remote lab work. To kick things off, I guess, tell me a little bit about the earliest point at which you knew some transitions needed to happen.
Let me give you some information about what my work is in this context so that it'll set the stage. In my sort of day job, I'm a lecturer at Princeton. And what this means is I'm responsible for designing courses and then executing them, actually teaching them. And this includes teaching the labs that are associated with introductory physics courses. And so in March of 2020, when we in the US were really becoming aware of and starting to take measures against the COVID-19 pandemic, it became clear that we were going to have to start teaching our classes remotely. And this was a huge hurdle for people that are teaching classes, of course, because we had to do this for the first time, at least those of us that don't normally teach online. But it was a much bigger hurdle when it came to teaching labs, because the labs really are predicated on being there in person with your hands, playing with equipment, turning screws and analyzing data that's coming from instruments you pick up in your hand. And so it was really, for me, it was right 3 days before our spring break happened in the spring of 2020. When the university administration came down and said, after spring break, at least for 2 weeks, we will be remote. And ultimately, we ended up being remote the whole rest of the semester. So it was, mid-March 2020.
Well, I took a number of physics courses, and I feel like I got a lot of value out of the labs and the hands-on demonstrations and things like that. I don't imagine that was necessarily planned to be remote. Was there a contingency plan in place, or did you have to invent everything from the start?
Everything was invented from the start. There was no contingency plan whatsoever. And that really made the challenge significant, I would say.
Well, I don't want to over-mathematize the problem. Not sure if that's a word, but if we're optimizing for something, what's the goal here?
Well, certainly one option that many people discussed is just abandoning the labs. And I wouldn't have faulted anybody for doing that, and I don't think anybody would have faulted me for doing it. I personally am a strong proponent of labs, and it's actually where I spend a fair amount of my creative work. I didn't want to abandon the labs. I wanted to try to figure out a way to do them in this remote world. The class that I teach now and the class I taught at that time was, for most of my students, the only class that they would take in physics. And so the idea of just eliminating the labs completely would have been, to me, a disservice to the students. So I didn't like the idea of completely abandoning them. And so then it evolved to, if we're not going to abandon them, we're going to do something. What are we going to do? This is something that I had meetings with other science faculty about, and nobody really had a good answer. So I viewed it as, okay, we can just do the best that we can. Of course, we're going to do that. But it also, to me, seemed like a real opportunity. Nobody's going to fault you for whatever you do. You're just going to do the best you can. To me, it felt like an opportunity to do something. And if you screwed up, it didn't matter, because at least you were trying. And so that's where I decided to develop different types of labs in this remote setting, and then try to assess whether or not which of these different types of labs seem to work the best. And it's an open question of what does it mean to work the best, but based on the measures I had, the idea was, let's do these 3 different types of labs and then see if we can measure which one kind of does the best at meeting our original goal for the labs.
And can we go through those 3 types?
So one of them, which the first one that we did, which was a very popular way of doing the labs at that time, was for an instructor of some sort to go into the lab themselves with a video camera of some sort and record themselves doing the experiment. And then they take this video, they post it somewhere for the students to view. And then if necessary, they send the students any data that they recorded. So in effect, what the lab becomes is a student watching someone do the experiment and then the student analyzing the data. The second type of lab that we did was a lab that was still measurement based, but the students, again, were not actually interacting with any equipment, but they were using an online application that had been developed. So in the physics education world, in the past, say, decade or so, a number of really, really great applications have been developed where you can go, through a web browser, you can access these things and adjust different parameters and see how electric fields evolved or see how different physical aspects will evolve. And so these apps are basically this little two-dimensional world where the computer user can control everything and then see how the digital world evolves, obeying the laws of physics. So the second experiment was to have these students use one of these apps, set up this digital world, and then watch it evolve and make some measurements, and then from there analyze data in a way that was a sort of virtual approximation of an experiment they might do in the real world. So that was the second kind, this kind of virtual experiment based on these online apps. The third kind of remote lab that we did was a project lab where it asked the students to define and do an experiment in the space where they were located, whether that was a few students remained on campus in their dorm room, isolated. Most of the students went home and were living wherever their home was. So this third kind of lab asked them to just look around the space where they're located, where they're living, pick up any kinds of stuff they had and put it together into an experiment that was in some way testing some of the physics we had learned that semester. And so this experiment was much more tangible, and it approached somewhat in a way similar to when they're in person. It approached a real experiment because they were using their hands. There was a real tactile sense for the experiment. It was limited, of course, because they didn't have the professional equipment that they might have had, and it was very uncontrolled. What that means is that the data that they got were not as likely to be really high quality data that could illustrate the points or the fundamental principles that they were trying to test. It was harder to do, but it did kind of approach the lab experience from the, having this really tactile component. So those were the three labs. There was the recorded lab, there was the virtual lab where they used an applet, and then there was the project lab where they drew from the equipment they had in wherever it was they were living.
All those sound viable, and I don't know that I have a personal preference for them. What can we do to measure some sort of goodness, or what does goodness even mean if we have to pick?
There are a couple of ways that I measured this. Had we known this was going to happen, there were some additional measures that we might have tried to make, but we, of course, couldn't predict this. The two ways that me and my colleague used to measure this, and my colleague is Soumya Shivan, who was a graduate student who helped implement some of these labs. The measurements that we made, the first one was we used a survey series called the E-Class. And this is a survey series that was developed by physics education researchers. And the idea is that by taking a pre and post survey, so that is a survey before doing the labs and then a survey at the end of the semester after doing the labs, this survey series, after you analyze the data, it assesses what kind of change each of the students has made, roughly speaking, in how much they think like a professional physicist. So this survey has something like 30 questions. The students answer these questions before and after, and then analyzing that data, you can see if the students have become more expert-like or less expert-like or roughly the same as before. So that was one measure that we took. That was the somewhat quantitative measure. And then the second measure that we took for these labs was all of the students had all done all of these different types of labs. So we interviewed them and asked them, each student, the exact same set of pre-developed questions about their experiences with each of the three types of labs. Then by assessing the answers to those questions, we could kind of parse at some of the things that we thought were important for students to get out of lab, and also some of the things that the students either enjoyed or just experienced in doing these three different kinds of labs.
Well, speaking first about the surveys, do you have any longitudinal data where we can compare a COVID year to a pre-COVID year?
What was actually pretty nice about the study that we did was because this happened in the spring of a 2-semester sequence, so that is the second semester of a 2-semester sequence, we happen to have data from the previous semester. So the fall semester, the students took the exact same survey series, and we learned a bit about how much they gained by doing the labs in the fall, the in-person labs in the fall. And then we had the survey that we did in the spring with these kind of remote labs. And I like this comparison because it's comparing somewhat apples to apples. It's the same set of students before and after. Before meaning in-person labs and after meaning remote labs. And what we saw was the statistics were not great since this was only 1 year of students and we got something like 30 responses to our survey in the spring. But what we saw was that, at least given the statistics we had, the learning gains made by these students in the spring seemed to be completely consistent with the learning gains made by the students in the fall. I don't think it's a very tight constraint, again, mostly because of the statistics that we had. And I would say that our in-person labs have been worked on for quite a while, and they are reasonably good labs, I think. So the labs in the spring, it was hard to do much better than what the previous in-person labs had done in the fall. But the thing that I took away from this measure was that the labs in the spring seemed to do just as good as the labs in the fall. So the remote labs seemed to do just as good as the in-person labs.
And when it comes to those more one-on-one interactions, I don't know if you'd call that a panel group or whatever, but the students you had a deeper interaction with, could you summarize or highlight some of the novel feedback you got from it?
There was a lot of feedback, actually, that came from this. One of them was almost uniformly the students were not crazy about the recorded labs, which really surprised me. But it was hard for them to actually understand what was being done in the video recording, which I think in hindsight kind of makes sense. You know, if you're doing an experiment in person, you can walk around to all different angles. You can touch something, you can pick it up, see what's happening. And a video doesn't capture that. And so that's something that makes sense in hindsight, but I did not predict. The students liked the virtual labs, the one that was based on an online web application. They seemed to like that, but mostly they seemed to like that because they found it to be easy. And this was not designed to be easy. And personally, I thought that experiment, that virtual lab itself was hard, but they found it to be very easy. And then that in turn led them to like it because Princeton students particularly they've got a lot going on. They're super busy. And so the idea of being able to do a lab that was easy and they could get through fast was enjoyable for them. But it did surprise me how many of them found that easy. And then the thing that was the biggest kind of revelation for me was the project labs. And of all the students that we interviewed, a vast majority of them said that the project lab was far and away their favorite. And that I thought was really interesting because my past experiences with students, at the university level is that they typically, at least in a class like this, they typically don't really enjoy being given complete freedom to do something. They like to be given a set of problems and asked to work on this and figure it out and how to do it. But the idea of something that's completely open-ended for them to define, I don't know if it's overwhelming, but it doesn't feel well constrained to them and they don't like it. So to hear a number of students say that the project lab was their favorite was surprising to me and kind of exciting. A kind of additional thing or sort of corollary that came out of this was that they said things like the project lab was multiple weeks long. And what they found was that even when they weren't actively working on the lab, they found themselves thinking about that, which was kind of awesome because if you have, as an instructor, if you can get your students to just start thinking about the content outside of class when you're not forcing them to think about it, I feel like you've won. And so to hear the students say that kind of thing, that they were constantly thinking about this and trying to come up with new ways to do the experiment, that showed me they were engaged. And if they're engaged, they're going to learn a lot. I did have, one student in particular told me hands down this is his favorite thing that he's ever done in a science class. And that kind of blew me away because the student, was in the second semester of their junior year. And they were a science major. So they've had a number of experiences in science classes. And to say that this was absolutely their favorite thing that they've ever done, it's anecdote, right? It's N equals 1, but it was quite a striking thing for them to say, especially when you coupled that with the fact that the majority of the students said that the project lab was their favorite overall. So I would say those were kind of the big takeaways from the interviews that we did with the students.
Well, all of this was out of necessity and need because we were pushed to go remote. It's kind of a natural experiment. But is there anything from this you think might inform how regular classroom instruction could evolve?
Let me answer a slightly different question first, and that is to say that I use this as a way to look at how the labs could evolve in the future when they're back to in-person. And based on this, to date, all of the labs that I've used in my classes have been project-based labs, where I give the students a lot more freedom to do things, to define the experiments, even more than they were given in the past, a lot more freedom to define the question, and then from that, define the experiment that they're going to do to try to answer that question. So I think that was a big takeaway. With the virtual labs, the lab where they did it based on an online app, it showed to me that the students can actually get a lot out of this. They can do it in a proficient way, and that's something that I think could be readily infused into a physics class in the future. And so I've started to try to infuse these into exercises that I give my students to do.
Well, Casey, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing the results.
It was really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Our second interview is coming right up. Stay tuned right after the break. Thanks to our sponsor, ClearML. ClearML is an open-source MLOps solution users love to customize. It helps you easily track, orchestrate, and automate ML workflows at scale. Machine learning is no fad. Your organization is only going deeper on investment. Don't let this be a source of technical debt. ClearML can improve every step in your ML workflow, making it a tool loved by data engineers, ML engineers, DevOps people, and data scientists alike. ClearML is hands down the best collaborative ML tool with full visibility and extensibility. As a contributor on a machine learning team, ClearML amplifies your efforts. As a manager, ClearML gives you the transparency and metrics to guide your team's efforts effectively when you can't get pulled into the weeds. Their solution logs your entire process. Your data and models are versioned, so there's no questions of provenance or audits that can't be done. Model repositories give you a clear view of available binaries, and you can deploy pipelines directly from code. Supercharge your entire development process. Go check out ClearML today. Visit clear.ml to get started. Thanks to our sponsor, Arctic Wolf. 2021 was a landmark year in cybersecurity. The rapid, piecemeal changes businesses made on the fly to infrastructure, applications, and access controls during 2020's huge shift to remote work were now under scrutiny, while security teams were still busy defending against the litany of attacks and attack methods. As the size, scope, and sophistication of attacks continued to grow, many organizations spent the last year overwhelmed by perpetual change, wondering when, where, and how things will ever improve. In early 2022, Arctic Wolf conducted a survey of over 300 global IT security decision makers to understand their priorities and anticipated challenges for the years ahead. Our goal was to understand their security roadmap for 2022 and to get a first-hand perspective on their current objectives and potential obstacles looming on the horizon. Visit arcticwolf.com/skeptic to find out what they learned. That's arcticwolf.com/skeptic.
Hi, I am Tahia Chaudhary. I am a doctoral researcher in computer engineering at Rutgers University. I am currently working on applying machine learning techniques for improving the quality of human life.
Very cool. I like that theme. Pretty broad, too. There's lots of ways human life can be improved with machine learning. Could you touch on some of the ways you're most excited?
My work mostly focuses on developing machine learning tools for modeling the physical world events so that we can learn the pattern of human living and then identify the needs of human at different parts of human life, the needs that we have, and then build applications to address those needs. So some of the applications that my work can be applied to are energy optimization in buildings, healthcare, home automation, and some of my recent work also addresses policymaking at both individual scale and collective scale.
When I think about applying machine learning in a business setting, it seems like my data set should be ready to go. I write like a SQL query against a database, maybe some feature engineering, but everything's digital. When it comes to those human events you were describing, I don't know that there's quite a digital record yet. Are there any challenges around assembling data sets?
Yes, of course. Because in the business, the tools that you are talking about, I believe they collect traces of information based on our, let's say, electronic records. Anything we do online has a record, has a digital trace, right? But in the physical world, this information needs to be collected in a passive way. So everything we do in the physical world, there is one way, for example, your Fitbit can keep track of what kind of activities you are doing, where you are going based on your location data. But there are also ways to collect information in a passive way, such as maybe you are in a room and anything you do in the physical world gives you a physical signature, such as if you turn on your microwave, there is a physical signature in terms of magnetic wave. So now if you have a sensor in the room that captures magnetic information, then any events that are associated with magnetic wave, you will be able to recognize it. And then once you collect information based on that, you can train your machine learning models to identify those events that are associated with this particular types of activity.
And we know that when the pandemic kicked off, it was a stair-step change and a natural experiment in a lot of ways. But I know even before that, there was some elements of remote learning. MOOCs have some popularity and things like that. Do you have a sense of what the scholarship or level of interest was prior to the pandemic in people looking at remote learning?
Most of the work, I think, even I got actually interested in remote learning once the pandemic started. A little bit of background about that is I was working as a teaching assistant for a course, for an introductory programming course. And that is precisely why I started working on this research project. So before that, I think most of the work was mostly focused on MOOCs, the massive open courseware. And I mean, there is a significant difference there. Even if the research focused on the online courses were based on like platforms such as Coursera or Udemy, but these courses are usually taken as a side interest. They don't really have like a institutional background. Whereas once the pandemic started, even the traditional higher education institutions started focused on we need to build tools and we need to have staff and student support in terms of delivering quality education, even on online learning. And now that, I mean, most of the universities or schools are now back to in-person, but even there is a notion of hybrid learning, where it looks like online learning is going to be here for a while. We are seeing like students being interested. In many courses, we don't actually need, it depends on the target of the curriculum. For programming courses, for example, you may think that some aspects of the courses you can easily transfer to online learning, but there are also courses that are important to be like you need to have a physical space. So I would say before the pandemic, it was mostly just how can we really do this at a scale? But now we are thinking about solutions that are specific to different schools and specific to different discipline even, because depending on what discipline you are, maybe humanities people are thinking about online learning in one way, and the STEM people are thinking about online learning in a different way.
Are there quantitative metrics we can consider if we want to make some apples-to-apples comparison between traditional in-person learning and remote learning? There'd be some way we could measure information retention. Maybe it's the final grade or something like that, but a way of saying how much did each student retain? And if they retain the same amount of information on average in both settings, then from that perspective, the settings are equivalent.
Yeah, you could say that, but that's just one dimension. I mean, learning can happen in so many different dimensions. You have to think about what type of students you have in class. I mean, research has shown, prior work has shown that what the students' intention with the course or the outcome, what do they want to achieve at the end of the semester, depends on what is their prior experience. What is their academic level? And it varies. And of course, it also depends on the discipline. So if you are just measuring in terms of objective measures, such as maybe exam scores or results, then there are also like, how do you make the comparison in terms of more subtle dimensions, such as like critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork? You need to design courses like that. It's not just exam scores. If you just focus on that, it's not going to be reflective of what the students were supposed to learn. And it's much harder to measure teamwork, critical thinking, these soft skills when we move to online setting, because you don't really see the students in action. They're just a part of your virtual environment or something. So if we want to make a comparison, I think one thing is we need to have different aspects of measures, like traditional exam would not work. Maybe project-based learning would be one way to go. There are also some works that show like self-directed learning sometimes works. Like you have like kind of like what the OpenCourseWare offers. Like you have a structured course, you have an outcome at the end of each week, and you deliver, you finish the work. And yeah, as long as you finish the work by the end of the week, you're fine. Something like that. That could be something because, I mean, the pandemic showed us that so many things are going on at people's home. People's personal life really makes an impact on your achievement, on your ability to get things done in professional life for students in their education, and especially when you're working from home, because you cannot really shut off your home environment while we are working. So if we really want to allow hybrid working, we need to think about other measures apart from exams or subjective scores. Yeah.
Well, my anecdotal, bias of how I look at this is to think that remote learning must, from the perspective of like learning collaboration and teamwork, must be inferior because you're just not there. You don't have proximity to people. If cameras aren't on, we don't get a good emotional sense of where people are coming from. Does that ring true, or am I just uncreative and not seeing ways in which maybe digital natives are better at collaborating online, or just different techniques we can bring about those in-person concepts in a digital way?
It's completely true. While I was working with the students, I talked to them, like I had interviews with them. And what I found is there are pros and cons of these online tools for sure. One thing students really appreciate is it's just one click away to get into the class. Instead of, if you think about like some of the students have to commute. I mean, for continuing education, students who are also working and taking classes, for them it's a blessing. But at the same time, if we want to think about, like you said, it must be inferior. It's inferior in the sense that what I found is if there are students who have been to this campus or who have made a peer network already based on their prior semesters. So when the classes move online, they don't have much trouble in navigating the hurdles of the course. But for the students who, for them, maybe it's the first challenging course they're taking, maybe it's the first course in that major they're intending to take eventually. For them, it's much harder because, there is a huge learning curve. And for them, there is no peer network to support. You cannot really hang out at the end of the week or at the end of the class to share your frustration and get together or work together. It becomes like, all your collaboration, everything becomes like through this Zoom. And the generation that we are talking about for students, they're more savvy with tech stuffs. That's the assumption. But even for them, I think they got bored of all this interaction through this digital technology cannot just simulate the experience they would have if they just get together at a cafe or maybe at a library and then work together on a project or pull an all-nighter before an exam.
Well, the paper gets into a particular study where you're able to compare two courses. Could you talk a little bit about those courses and what the differences are?
So these two courses are introductory programming course that we offer at our university for students who intend to take computer engineering or computer science as their major. And it's a required course. It's usually for the students who have never learned another programming language in a formal education before. So the courses mostly cover C and C++. The concepts we cover are data structure, basic problem solving using programs, sorting, binary search, like basic concepts. But it's like very good. Once you learn one programming language, the others become pretty easy. So for students, we call them introductory student or beginner students. So for beginner students, this become pretty challenging, especially if you think about the context. The other courses they are taking in the same semester, if one or two other are also hard, that takes a lot of effort and you're learning way too many things that are new to you every week, then it becomes very overwhelming. So these courses mostly cover just problem solving. Some of the things we intend to do is create like a programmatic thinking. Like you are given a problem, how would you think about what is the best way to solve it? That is the intention of these courses. So one course is offered in every spring, the other is offered in summer, but the materials are pretty much the same.
Should we be concerned about the different time lengths of the course, that one is more intense and that could bias our outcome?
Of course, yeah. There are also individual differences, right? We are not getting the same students, the same set of students, and that could be also biasing the outcome. Because, some years, students, you cannot really make an apple-to-apple comparison when you're thinking about this kind of study in an education setting. But one thing is, when we are comparing the pre-COVID data that we have, both courses were offered before COVID and after COVID, once it moved to online. So we have data from before COVID when the course was offered as in person, both course A and course B. And once COVID started, I think back in spring 2020, we moved online. So course A became online for 7 weeks and course B was completely online. So we have data from both pre-COVID and after COVID.
When you look at just the pre-COVID data, are there any noteworthy differences between A and B?
Yeah, so, if we take the COVID out of our mind, just compare the two courses. So course A, it's designed more as a traditional course, so it's a 14-week course. On the other hand, even if we are kind of squeezing all the materials into course B, because we have 4 classes in each week, in comparison to for course A, the spring course, it has 2 classes each week. But you are usually taking a lot more courses at that time in spring. But in summer, usually students take only 2 courses, so they have more time to focus on a specific course. In terms of that, I would say one significant difference that the class size is smaller because not a lot of students take class during summer. And students' performance are more, I would say, on average, they do better because they don't have other stuffs going on. Usually students take it because they want to improve. Maybe they have taken this course before but didn't do that well, or they just want to get ahead and maybe they have some other course in mind they want to take in spring. So in terms of performance, I would say the spring course students perform better considering the big sample size. Usually the class is around 200 people or something. But the summer courses students are usually spending a lot more time on each assignments and they can focus more time. They can invest more time.
One advantage you have in this study is you can reach out to the TAs and get real-time feedback. Could you share some of the insights you learned from that process?
Yes, students prefer to express their frustrations or any struggles a lot more. I would say they're a lot more expressive to the TAs sometimes. So if you want to really know about what's going on in the class and any feedback from the students, it's always helpful to get some feedback from the TAs about that. So once the classes moved online, actually, students were frustrated because one thing is they're not really getting ambience of the class anymore. Usually, if you think about when these programming labs happen, students just come to the class, they look around in the lab and see other students are working on. And that actually gives you like a motivation to work on the problem. But whereas if you are just working from home, you log into your computer, you get into that lab session, even if it's synchronized, there is no incentive to be really interacting with your peers, right? You have to unmute yourself, you have to turn off your camera. And there is a subtle psychological aspect here that, these are introductory students and many of them may be introverts and they just don't interact very well. For these introvert students, the TAs have to actively spend quite some time so that they can speed up with the learning. Otherwise, for the first few weeks are always the hardest because if you don't spend enough time. So what the TAs saw that students were frustrated that they're not really seeing, they're struggling, but they're not really seeing how the other students are doing. In your mind, I must be the only one who is struggling, but in reality, there were other students who were struggling. But if you were taking the lab in person, then this kind of frustration actually gets mitigated because you get into the lab, you sit, and whenever you are stuck on a problem, you look around and see that other students are also experience the same thing. And that helps to keep your motivation intact that, okay, if I spend more time, if I maybe a couple more weeks into this, maybe I'll get the hang of it. So that's one thing. And that actually puts a lot of pressure on the TAs because in a physical lab, we can just send a common message or teach the students using the Blackboard or using the PowerPoints. But when we are showing the slides, you don't really know whether the students are really paying attention or no. It's very easy to get distracted. Some students, I do believe that I've heard some students just log into their Zoom call and then just start doing something else. And I think the ambience plays a really big role here. If you are in that particular setting, that gives you like a belonging to the learning that's going to happen soon. When you are physically into the lab in front of your computer and there are other students working on it, that plays a big role. So that was one challenge. The other thing is the courses that I'm talking about is very diverse in terms of the student population, and there are also language barriers. There are different cultures. When there is language barrier, being physically in the lab, using body language and visual cues, you can surpass many of these gaps. But when you are online, it's just what you are saying and maybe whatever you type on the chat. That's all. And there is a lot of information leakage there. That's one issue that the TAs found really, like you spend a lot more time expressing the concepts in comparison to what you would have spent if you were physically teaching the class. Those are the two issues. And students don't show up in the office hours much, I would say. But when we were offering office hours in physical setting, we would have had a lot more students and they were really invested. And usually when students come in one office hour and they feel like they were getting benefited, they keep coming. But we didn't really notice that when classes moved in virtual setting. It's just usually just one or two persons who just come for some clarification question, and that's all.
Do you think that's a fundamental limitation of, the intersection of human culture and remote learning? Or can we come up with facsimiles for that'll be reasonable for students to get the same benefit in a virtual way?
I do think that the virtual settings are kind of designed for one-to-many instruction. I'm talking about platforms such as Zoom or WebEx. These are usually more appropriate for lectures where you have one person who will take the speaker role and several people will be listening to it. But when we are talking about a learning environment that requires peer learning, interaction with TAs and also interaction with your peers, creating small groups, collaboration, these tools really don't simulate those. There is no side channel communication. In a physical setting, you can just lean and talk to your neighbors about something, but there is no way to do that. Everything is you have to go to the chat, but if you want to share something, how would you do it? Maybe I'm experiencing some kind of bug in my code. I can just show my screen to some other students, but in this virtual setting, how would I really do that? There is no way to do it unless you do it to the entire class. So there is no, even if the breakout rooms are allowed to be created, you cannot really create it by yourself. Someone has to create it. The host has to create it. So there are small scale missing points that we cannot just simulate through these tools. In the future of work literature, people have also noticed that if we are planning to do hybrid mode of working, we want to take the best of both worlds. There are, of course, benefits from the virtual learning, but there are also cons that we need to minimize, such as this kind of missing interactions. So I believe there is some tool that was created to create office sound, to create if you're missing the sound your coworkers make while you are working. So there is also a special kind of vibe when you get to a university setting, students hanging around. And there are also rules, when you go to a library, you cannot really drink in an open-lidded cup. No food is allowed. That kind of sets your mindset you are in a different environment, whereas there is no boundary when you are working from home. So your brain is in the same mode while it's eating and while it's working. You are allowed to watch your TV. You can open your refrigerator as many times as you want. So to give your brain that signal that you are actually in a different environment and you want to turn on your learning mode now. I think this environment cues really plays a big role there.
Well, as you'd mentioned, some schools are moving back to in-person, but maybe we'll have some sort of hybrid system going forward. Given the things you've looked into and the results from your research, if you were given a big budget and control to set up a new style of coursework, do you have any thoughts on an optimal way of doing that?
Yeah, I think even before the pandemic started, I think there were some articles in the Chronicles of Higher Education definitely offering virtual courses. Online courses had their benefits because it requires less money, for sure. You don't really have to spend a lot of money in the physical infrastructure in terms of maintaining the physical infrastructure. Most of the money comes from, I guess, the instruction cost and also platform cost. So there were some thinking about that already. And now that the pandemic has showed us that it's possible, whatever reluctance we used to have back then, the pandemic kind of has showed us that it is possible if we want to. But I don't think we really have the tools. If there are two options available and they are not really comparable, like the virtual classes have their convenience, but they are not really simulating the same experience if you would take this class in an in-person setting, then students are going to be not so interested in it. So the only way the universities can go in that route is if they know that the students will be interested in both mode, then there is an incentive to create a hybrid culture. But for that, I believe it would require more. It puts a lot of pressure on the instructor to create a hybrid course. From an instructor's point of view, it's a lot of work because you need to record lectures.
Well, usually before I go into a wind-up, I like to ask, is there anything you think I should have asked you about that we didn't get to?
I mean, this is just a surface-level study. I would love to do something where we didn't really track how the students progressed after the classes moved to in-person. Like, this is just a single course, 2 offerings. But there are some courses or some learning materials that, like, you have 2 parts of the course that are offered, one in fall and another in spring. And if students take one part of the course in a virtual setting, does that really affect their performance in the subsequent part of the course? Like, you take part 1 in physical setting, is it more beneficial for your performance in part 2 if you had taken this course in physical setting as opposed to the virtual setting?
That's a good question, yeah. And can you share any thoughts on the research direction you're headed in? What are some of the other questions you're currently asking?
Actually, this project is somewhat orthogonal to what I work on, but I would love to find like some ways for creating like a level playing field for students, because right now it's like the virtual classes are kind of dominated by students who are more interactive. Usually in every class, in every meeting, I would say, there's a certain percentage of people who love to interact, and classes and meetings are dominated by these people. And that actually creates like an interaction gap for students. And in many courses, this interaction is a very important ingredient for their learning improvement, peer learning, critical thinking. So there are some, I think, real-time feedback tools now that are coming out for meetings. I think there is this company called Read AI that is doing like real-time feedback based on your facial expression, like how interactive you are in the meeting, how many times you are interrupted by some other people, things like that. Maybe we need to have this kind of personalized feedback system for classes as well to improve students' interaction in the class in virtual setting. And that's one way to maybe simulate the experience they would receive in an in-person setting and do that in online. I would love to see in future work something along that line.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on Data Skeptic and share your research.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
That concludes another installment of Data Skeptic Physically Distributed. Thanks to our sponsors today, ClearML and Arctic Wolf Networks. Myself, Claudia Armbruster, as associate producer, Vanessa Bly, guest coordinator, show notes written by David Abembe, and our host, Kyle Polich.